All right, so this is chapter 1, and it's really just an introduction of how anatomy and physiology sort of fits into the general scientific spectrum, and then the basics of A&P that we'll use to continue. So first up, what do these two words mean? Anatomy and physiology, oftentimes they go together because they describe two different aspects of the same thing, and that is the human body, and not just human body, but all biological living things have a structure, and that structure has a function. You know, the organization of things is what brings about what that thing does, or what that organism does. So anatomy is all about the structure. In other words, the relationship between the internal and external structures of an organism. So in a sense, anatomy is kind of static. In other words, it doesn't change. You know, you can look at an organism, you can look at a picture, and you can see its anatomy. Physiology is you put that structure in motion. So how does that structure, how does that organism perform the functions that it performs? And in this course, we're going to talk about both of these things. And one of the general themes of A&P is that anatomy brings about physiology, and physiology works because of the anatomy. So particularly next semester, you're going to see how anatomy and physiology together are what really make, you know, the human being do what it does. It's important, this course has a lot of terminology. You know, in a way, it's as much a language course as it is a science course. So along the way, you know, pay attention to the new words and new phrases, new ways of using words, because one of the things you're supposed to learn in this course, you know, we don't require a medical terminology course for most of our medical professions. And the reason for that is because A&P does that for you. You know, so along the way, you're going to be learning your medical terminology as well. So, and at the end of today, we're going to talk a little bit about the Greek and Latin words that are used, you know, in anatomy and physiology, and can be kind of daunting, but how we can take those things apart. All right. But first off, you know, A&P could really be called human biology, because it's the study of the human organism as a biologic living thing. So, you know, what are the characteristics of living things in general? Well, there's this, short list. These are true of all living things. So all living things are responsive. In other words, they change in response to stuff that happens in their environment. You know, this is true for a cell as well as, you know, a large complicated organism like a human being. You know, so we respond to things. And some of the ways we respond to things are to move. So living things have movement. Now, they may not move themselves, you know, like trees don't move, but there is movement that takes place inside that living organism. So, you know, we share that with them. Adaptability. In order to survive in a world that's changing all the time, we have to be able to change, you know, organisms have to be able to change what they do to adapt to the changing world. You know, so an example of this is, you know, when it gets cold outside, our metabolism speeds up to help keep us warm on the inside, creating more heat. And when it's very warm outside, our metabolism slows down. So that's an example of adaptability. Growth and reproduction. You know, the body is growing all the time, not just when we're children, but even as adults all the way until we die, because cells don't live as long as we do. At least most cells don't. You know, muscle cells, nerve cells, okay, they do. But all the other cells of the body have to be replaced. So in order to do that, they have to grow, they have to divide. And then at the end of next semester, you'll be talking about reproduction and how the human organism basically feeds forward its genes into the next generation, and the anatomy and physiology of that. All right. And then respiration is the utilization of oxygen to produce energy. And we're going to talk a little bit about this when we get into the cell here in a week or two, and we talk about the mitochondria. But you all know that you have to breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide. The reason you do that is that oxygen is used to release energy from the food that you eat. And then the result of that reaction that produces energy is the formation of CO2. So this respiration takes place at the cellular level, and it also takes place at the organism level as we breathe in and out, bring oxygen in, and get carbon dioxide out. Circulation, different parts of the human being do different things. You know, that's sort of what organs are for, to isolate a particular function in one place. Well, all the cells of the body need all the organs of the body. So the only way to have those organs take care of all those cells is we have to be moving something around all the time. And that is blood and lymph, both of which you'll cover in the second semester. But circulation is a key component to all living organisms. Because even at the cellular level, if you look inside one cell, things are still circulating and moving around. It's the only way to keep nutrients and waste products sort of going in their correct directions. Digestion is something all living things do. This is where large molecules, usually made by other living things, you know, like plants make vegetables and fruits, and animals make muscle that becomes meat. Digestion is where we break those large molecules down into smaller pieces that then can be used to do what our body needs them to do, either to be used as fuel or to be used as building blocks for things like cells, proteins, bone, that kind of stuff. And then finally, excretion. You know, all living things create waste products as part of their metabolism. So to prevent those waste products from building up, they have to be gotten rid of. So the two systems that we have that perform excretion are the digestive system and the urinary system. Again, both of which are going to cover not this semester, but next semester. So we do, in fact, fit all the characteristics of living organisms. So, in fact, you are alive. Aren't you glad? All right, so this book, as well as almost all A&P books, start with this same pattern of sort of building up to the human being as an organism. So the first thing we're going to talk about, not today, but here in the next couple of weeks, is we're going to talk about chemicals. We're going to do a little biochemistry mini course. So if you have a strong background in chemistry, our first Chapter 2 lecture is going to seem very simple to you, but not everybody does. So, you know, it's an opportunity for people who maybe don't have a strong chemistry background to sort of at least learn what you need to know for A&P, so you'll be able to go forward. Chemicals we'll see form together to make cells. You know, cells are relatively complex things. You know, they have organs, which we call organelles. They have a variety of different functions, some of which we'll see here in a minute. So we'll spend a whole a chapter talking about cells. Cells come together and join together to make tissues. A tissue is a group of cells that perform a similar function. And then tissues, in every organ, there is more than one kind of tissue. So different tissue types form together in a specific anatomy to create an organ. And then organs create some or provide some function for the body. So, you know, like the kidneys really get rid of waste products. The lungs bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. And all of those organs that you've all heard about are formed from different tissues, and those tissues are all formed by cells. So we can sort of build up this level of organization. And then all the organs working together, we get to the organism and organ systems, which is what we'll start talking about when we get to Chapter 5, which is the integumentary system or skin system. So that's just the levels of organization, and that's kind of how we'll introduce or get, you know, we'll wade into anatomy and physiology by starting at chemistry, then going to cells, tissues, and then the rest of the 2 semesters is all organ systems. All right. So cells. When we talk about cells here in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about general characteristics of all cells. But what's important to know is there's no such thing as a normal cell. You know, each cell has its own specific function, and therefore it has its own anatomy and its own physiology. So what we'll end up talking about is how all the cells are the same, even though it's the differences between the cells that are really most important. So like, for example, the whole top of this slide here these are examples of different cells that we find in the body. So we have these long, spindly cells here that can actually contract and make themselves shorter, so those are smooth muscle cells. Blood cells, here's this little red disc, very tiny cells in the scope of things. Larger white blood cells around there. Bone cells are really quite fascinating. They have this kind of spider-like appearance, and they can be quite large, and they actually produce the hard stuff that makes up bone. Fat cells have these, just a little tiny nucleus, and then they're full of lipid. It's an energy storage molecule, so we can store up energy that we don't use for later, so to speak. In the digestive tract, we have these tall, skinny cells that are all lined up next to each other. In the reproductive tract, we end up with a giant oocyte or egg, and then a teeny tiny little sperm, and the two of those together make a zygote, which can go on to make a human being. And then in the nervous system, we have the most complicated anatomy of cells anywhere in the body. I mean, nerve cells, this is a simple one, so to speak. Nerve cells can be exceedingly complex, have hundreds or even thousands of connections to other cells. So when you look at all these, you don't see very many things in common. But when we do talk about the cell here in a bit, we'll talk about some of the things that all these cells share in common. And just as a reminder from biology, the basic principles of cell theory, the theory is that all life, at least all life on Earth, is made up of cells. How can we say that? Because we've never found a living thing for which that was not the case. So every living thing that's ever been documented here on planet Earth is made up of cells. So we say the theory is that cells are the structural building blocks of plants and animals, so all living things. All cells come from other cells. So cells don't just happen. They divide from pre-existing cells. So only a cell can make a cell. And then finally, the cell is sort of the functional unit of life on Earth. In other words, it's the smallest unit that performs all of the characteristics of a living thing. So it's the smallest part of the organism that has all of these characteristics of the living organism. So cells are sort of the foundation of biology. All right, cells together can form tissues, and tissues, we'll spend, again, several class sessions just talking about the different tissue types. But everything in your body is one of these four kinds of tissues. It's either epithelial tissue, which lines the surfaces of things. Epithelial tissue also creates glands that produce secretions or substances for various purposes. Connective tissue connects things, not surprisingly. It sort of fills the spaces between these other three tissue types. And connective tissue is the most diverse of the groups. In other words, there's more kinds of connective tissue than there are of any of these other three tissue types. So this is things like fat, bone, ligaments that hold muscles together, the internal structure of the heart, for example. All of these are connective tissues. Muscle tissue, its claim to fame is it can contract. So all movement that takes place inside the body or the body moving itself all happens because of muscle. And it's because muscle can pull itself into a shorter shape. And by doing that, it can make things move. Whether it's your arm moving, your heart moving to pump blood, or your digestive tract pumping, digestion materials through, all movement in the body comes from this muscle tissue. And there's three kinds. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, which we'll talk in great length about later on in the course. And then neural tissue, its specialization is it conducts electrical impulses, and it also produces substances that make changes in other cells. So the command and control system of the body is nervous tissue, which uses this electrical conductivity to actually make chemical changes that then make things happen. And towards the end of the course, in Unit 3, this course anyway, we're going to talk at length about neural physiology. How do nerves work? How do those chemicals that they release make all the fancy stuff that we know our nervous system does happen. So all tissues, everything in the body is one of these 4 tissue types, and we'll go into much more detail about that later on. All right. So tissues come together to make organs. All organs are made up of more than one tissue type. And we divide the organs of the body up into systems. And after our first 4 chapters, where we do chemistry, cells, and then tissues, the rest of the course, both semesters, is we're going to do organ systems. So we're going to talk about the skin, which is the integumentary system, skin and hair. We're going to talk about the skeletal system, all the bones, the muscular system, all the skeletal muscles that move the bones around. These 2 together, we'll talk about the joints, which is articulations, or how the body moves, essentially. There's the nervous system, the endocrine system. Cardiovascular system is the first chapter in A&P 2. The lymphatic system, the respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. So we're going to get to endocrine in the first part, in this first semester, and then the rest of these you're going to cover in A&P 2. All right. All right, so here's our first question. And what you'll see happen here in a minute is, okay, so you want to get to your Socrative. So anatomy is what here? And what you'll see happen is I just sent you a multiple choice question. So you should have A, B, C, D, or E as an answer you can give. There we go, and I'm starting to get answers. And I don't get your name. All I get is who picked which answer. So I get like a bar graph of A, B, C, D, and E. And it tells me not who answered, but what the general answers for the course or for the students are. And I've got a bunch of questions in here today. We might have to skip some, but I wanted you to see how it worked. All right. And good. Most of you got that. The correct answer is C. So anatomy is structure. D, which was the second most popular answer, the study of living organisms, is biology. So the more specific study of structure is anatomy. Now you could say that A, the study of function, that's physiology. So we have anatomy and physiology, function and structure. And then, let's see. A branch of physiology, no. Anatomy and physiology, they're equals. One is not above the other. All right. So a tissue is which of those things? Jump in there, last few people. All right, there's some variation in this one. All right, the correct answer here is D. A tissue is a group of cells with a similar structure and function. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the tissue chapter. But a tissue is cells of the same type, basically, that are all in one place. All right, we're going to skip that one. Okay, so one of the key components of understanding physiology is this idea of homeostasis. And I know you've all heard this word before in your past biology classes, but just as a refresher, homeostasis is basically the body preserving itself. You know, in order for a living thing to continue to function normally, it has to maintain its internal environment, and it has to maintain itself in a particular way. You know, it has to have energy to use, it has to keep itself at a certain temperature, a certain pH, all those things. So homeostasis, in order for this to occur, the body has to be responsive, like we saw on that list, characteristics of living things. Homeostasis is how the body responds to a departure from normal or a problem. So the three main components of homeostatic reflex are you have to have a receptor. In other words, you have to be able to tell something has changed. You need to have a control center. Something has to decide what to do or create a change anyway. And then there has to be an effector. You have to be able to do something about what you're looking at. So the classic example here that we all have in our homes is, your furnace or your air conditioner. So if you think of the normal state is, room temperature, so we'll say 76 degrees. Well, if that temperature goes up, because it's hot outside, and we go up to 78 degrees, in order to maintain that normal 76, well, first we have to know there's been a change. So that's why you have a thermostat. The thermometer in the thermostat detects temperature. So when it detects that the temperature has gone up, it sends that information to the control center, which is the switch in the thermostat that turns the air conditioner on. And then that control center creates an effect. It turns the air conditioner on, which lowers the temperature from 78 back down to 76. And once that occurs, then this feedback mechanism is turned off, because now we're back to homeostasis, so nothing needs to change. Now, the technical definition for this kind of a mechanism is called a negative feedback mechanism. In other words, the departure from normal is negated. In other words, it is reduced to nothing or reduced to zero, and is therefore then brought back to its zero state, or its normal. So just like the air conditioner in your house, we have these lots of these feedback mechanisms in the body too. Normal body temperature, 98.6 degrees, right? Well, if you go outside without a coat today, eventually that temperature is going to decrease. And there are receptors in the skin and in the brain that detect that change. It sends a signal to the brain, and the brain responds by triggering heat conservation and heat production changes. So, for example, we have ups and downs here. So 37 degrees C is the normal range. If we go above that, the body tries to lose that extra heat. So you sweat. Your vessels in your skin dilate so that you can radiate heat out to the air. Your breathing rate increases because as you breathe, you evaporate a lot of water, and that cools the body. In the other direction, say you've gotten too cold, like outside today, your blood vessels constrict to try to hold on to that heat. So your skin gets very pale, your fingers get kind of white. You don't sweat. The sweating response decreases. You tend to breathe through your nose instead of your mouth as a way to conserve heat when you're cold. You tend to not breathe out of your mouth. And then also, if you get cold enough, you'll start to shiver. That's your muscles contracting to create heat, to actually keep you warm and warm you up. It's one of the reasons why on a cold day like this, you'll feel your muscles tense. You'll feel tense outside when you're cold. That's your muscles trying to keep you warm by creating contraction. All right. Now, the other kind of feedback mechanism, which is a little harder to get, and it's rarer in the body, is called a positive feedback. This is where a small departure from normal creates a large effect. So the two examples that you hear of this positive feedback are the clotting system and delivering the baby during pregnancy. So let's look at this. So we've had some damage to a blood vessel here. Instead of a nice continuous wall like we're supposed to have, we've got a hole here. Well, the exposure of this hole to this area, it gets platelets to stick here. Now, when platelets start to stick to each other, they get more platelets to stick to each other. So it's a positive feedback mechanism. One thing makes many things happen, and then those many things make even more things happen. So it's sort of like multiplication or a geometric increase. So what we get is a small change, exposure of this tissue to this tissue, creates a large change, which is a big blood clot. So generally, these positive feedback loops, they continue to get bigger and bigger until whatever the inciting event has been stopped. So like in this case, we get more and more clotting until this area has been sealed off and is no longer, visible from this area. Now, in delivering the baby, we get this same thing. With each contraction, the contraction actually gets stronger each time as the body makes more and more chemical to create stronger and stronger contractions. So essentially, contractions create stronger contractions. So it's another positive feedback mechanism. We don't see these as often, but when they're present, they tend to make big things happen. Like a blood clot, for example, happens very quickly and can be very robust, and it's because of this positive feedback system. Yes, positive feedback systems can get out of hand. Not very often, but much more easily than negative ones can. Because in a sense, there's no off switch. There's no automatic off switch. It can keep going even when it shouldn't.
How does the blood clot know when to stop?
Well, like here, once the tissue has been sealed up, then the original stimulus to start clotting disappears. So it does stop, but it won't stop until it's completely sealed, which is kind of a good thing for clots. All right, we're going to skip questions because we're running a little slow today. All right, anatomical position. Get this picture in your mind because everything in anatomy is labeled according to this. In other words, and do this at home. Stand like this for a few minutes so you remember. This is anatomic position. Now, here's what I mean by that. When we go to say where one thing is in relationship to another, we're going to use this standardized position. So, like, if I were to tell you, are the palms of the hands towards the front or towards the back in anatomical position? They're pointing forward. So they're anterior, as we'll see when we get to those words in a minute. So it's very simple, but you'll see particularly when we get to the bones and muscles and we start talking about movement, that anatomical position is important to remember. So the thing people mistake the most is the position of the hands. Because how do we stand naturally? We stand with our palms pointed inwards towards our trunk. But in anatomic position, we have our hands rotated out so that palms are up. So standing, palms forward, that's anatomic position. All right. So our first vocabulary words, anterior and posterior. Anterior is towards the front. So everything we can see here in figure A is anterior. Posterior is towards the back. So everything in figure B is posterior, and we're going to see some other words here in a minute. All right. So the different regions of the body have landmarks. And this is our first slide where you'll see a little box here saying you should be familiar with all these terms. What I'm saying here is this is a to-be memorized slide because these are medical terms that are used in the description of where things are at in the body. In a medical chart, it is better to say antebrachium than it is to say arm or forearm because that's more specific. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want you to. Generally speaking, in terms of pronunciation, all the letters get sounded out. So, there aren't very many silent letters in Latin and Greek. And as we'll get to here in a minute, if I hear you pronouncing something incorrectly, I'll just correct you. In other words, I'll tell you the right way to say it. I'm not being mean or nitpicky or whatever. I'm just trying to help you not sound like you don't know what you're talking about, even when you do. So particularly in lab, you'll hear me correcting your Greek and Latin. All right. So we typically work on the patient from the outside, not from the inside, even though in anatomy, a lot of times we think about the patient from the inside out. So anatomical landmarks are things that we can see on the outside that give us a clue as to what's on the inside. So, for example, the iliac crest or your hip bone, which is here and here, that's an example of a superficial landmark. And like when some of you learn how to give injections, you're going to use that landmark to sort of map where the muscles are around that landmark. So an anatomical landmark is something you can see on the surface of the body. Usually it's a spot that is relatively consistent across patients. Another one is behind your ear. You'll have this bony, round bony thing that sits behind your ear, and when you tap on it, it sounds kind of hollow. That's another landmark. That's the mastoid process. And it shows you where one of the muscles connects, in that case, the sternocleidomastoid. So anatomical landmarks we use all the time in patient care. And as we get to some of those in later chapters, we'll point those out. All right. Okay, probably some of the most important stuff from this whole today chapter is right here in this slide, okay, and in the next one when we talk about planes. These directional terms you are going to use not just in this class, but for the rest of your lives in describing things about patients, okay? So we use these, they're sort of relationship terms. So, for example, cranial and caudal. Cranial is toward the head, caudal is toward the tail. Now, we don't have a tail, but where our tail would be, which would be at the end of our sacrum. So when you're talking about the spine, for example, the cranial end of the spinal cord is where the brain is, and the caudal end of the spinal cord is where what we call the cauda equina is. So cranial to caudal we use to describe really the spinal column. So the head is cranial to the lumbar spine. The thoracic spine is cranial to the sacrum. The sacrum is caudal to the thoracic spine. You kind of get that? So depending on which direction you're going, you can describe where things are. Okay, so cranial and caudal. Anterior and posterior we already talked about, but there's another word for front and back. In the human being, because we stand upright, anterior and ventral are synonyms. So ventral technically means towards the belly. Now our belly is in the front. So ventral is toward the belly, dorsal is towards the back. So in the human, anterior and ventral are the same, posterior and dorsal are the same. So they're synonyms. Now, why just the human being? If you think about a dog's ventral side points towards the ground. Where's its belly? It's at the bottom, right? And where's its back? It's at the top. But because we stand upright, posterior and dorsal are always towards the back. Anterior and ventral are towards the front. All right. Medial and lateral. Medial is towards the midline of the body. Lateral is toward the outside. So in anatomic position, the thumb is lateral to the pinky, right? Because the pinky is medial, it's towards the midline. That means that the thumb is lateral, it's towards the outside. So medial and lateral. And then proximal and distal we use particularly with the limbs. Proximal means closer to the middle, closer to the trunk, closer to the center. And when you think of the center of the body, think chest, like where the heart is, because that's kind of how the old anatomists thought. So proximal is towards the middle. Distal is towards the end. So, the end of your middle finger is the most distal part of your arm because it's furthest away from your middle in the center. So get familiar with these. Try to use them. Where is your knee in relation to your ankle? Well, the ankle is distal to the knee is proximal to the ankle. Okay? Because you're gonna hear these words over and over again in this course. All right. Planes. One of the challenges with anatomy and physiology is what you have to look at most of the time, except in lab and in the cadaver lab, which you'll all get to see the cadaver next week. So that'll be cool. We're going to go to the lab. But most of the pictures you see when you're learning anatomy, two-dimensional. We don't have the technology yet to put three-dimensional models in textbooks, right? So you end up looking at a 2D depiction of a three-dimensional thing. So you have to always be remembering while you're studying anatomy that the body is not flat. We don't exist as South Park characters, with no third dimension. Instead, we have a third dimension, and it matters. So one of the ways that we can think about the body in 3D is to think of 3 planes that we can divide the body into. Okay, so in the frontal plane, which is this one right here, we've cut the body into a front half and a back half. So when we look at an image of that, here's what we see. We see that's through the frontal plane. So that's one image. You see the frontal plane a lot in pictures in your anatomy book, like Anatomic Position. That's a picture in the frontal plane, right? Or when you look at muscles and bones, a lot of times the picture is looking like this, taken from the front. So we see a lot of the frontal plane. We have to remember that there's 2 other planes that have relationships too. The sagittal plane cuts the patient into left and right. So a mid-sagittal section goes right through the middle, but any sagittal plane you're looking at the patient from the side, essentially. So like here from the side, boy, we get a great view of the spinal cord, even though we don't really see it very well in the frontal plane, because the spinal cord is towards the back, and this frontal section is a little bit more towards the front. And then the last plane we look at is the transverse plane. This is cutting the patient along the long axis. So like CT scans, which many of you will get a chance to see, are usually filmed in the transverse plane. So it's good to think about the anatomy because you're going to occasionally see pictures in this direction. Yeah. Did you have a question? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Sorry. So frontal, sagittal, transverse plane. And I'll try to show you some examples of these as we go through the organ systems, because the key is to think about the body in 3 dimensions all the time. So for example, when you look at a picture of the chest, what you usually see is you see lungs on 2 sides and a heart in the middle, right? Well, the reality in 3 dimensions is it's not that simple. The heart is actually in front and the lungs are all behind the heart. So it's just one example of how a 2-dimensional image doesn't give you all the information. So as we go through the anatomy, I'll try to show you the other 3-dimensional relationships outside of just the frontal plane. Like the lungs, for example, where the heart is very much towards the front and the lungs are very much towards the back, not heart in the middle, lungs to the 2 sides. All right, we're about out of time today, so. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about with my remaining 2 minutes is word roots. Greek and Latin use kind of the Lego model of language. In other words, we take small word roots and we put them together to make increasingly specific words. So for example, gastrocolic reflex. Gastro means stomach. Colic means colon. So this is the stomach to colon reflex. You kind of get that? And you're going to see these compound words a lot in this course. So instead of being scared by these big, long, strange words, think of them in their parts. Gastrocolic, okay, well, where have I heard gastro before? Well, gastric, okay, stomach. Here's another example, cytotoxic T cells. Cyto is cell, toxic is deadly. So what is this cell likely to be? Deadly to cells, right? Cytotoxic T cells. So word roots are a good way to learn anatomy. There's a list in your book, and it's worth going over some of these just to familiarize yourself with them. And as you're studying, Wikipedia has a great big long list of medical word roots. So you might want to put this in your favorites because it can help you remember what a term or a phrase means by knowing what the word roots mean. Then you can put it together for yourself. All right, thank you, everybody. I will see you all on Monday.